Good evening, gentlemen. Welcome you all. This is Srinivas Reddy Vanga. Thanks for joining this evening for the first meeting of the season. It's my great pleasure to meeting you all. First of all, my thanks to Dan and Jill Hubbard, Vice President, AACEI MCS, who makes this happen. Dan is a lead engineer who has a multifaceted talent person. I would like to ask Jill, our Vice President, ACI MCS, to introduce her colleague, Dan, who is presented this evening. Jill will explain the rules of this meeting and she will take over from here. Stay safe. Thank you, Jill.
Okay, thank you. Welcome everyone. My name is Jill Hubbard. I'm the new Vice President of the chapter. For Zoom, try and keep yourself on mute. Normally I'd have the power to mute you, but we had a bit of a difficulty logging in this first time, so I do not have that power. If you have a question, you can unmute yourself or type it into the chat. So I'd like to introduce Dan. Oh, and say hi to Bob. He just disappeared, but I just noticed he joined. Hi, Bob. So Dan Sweeney is a lead engineer with MVP. He's currently working as the deputy to the project director on the DCMP, the Silver Line, for Package B, which is the new rail yard. Dan's experience ranges from scheduler to construction manager to forensic engineer. He's worked on many projects in the DC area, including renovation of the Cannon House building, the United States Foreign Embassy, as well as what he's doing now on the Silver Line, which is pretty much everything from closeout to work in the field and all that. So he's an avid traveler who loves a good beach as much as a steep mountain to climb, and he's currently working on his MBA from Georgetown. So welcome, Dan. And Dan's going to present Failure, the Unheralded Key to Our Success. I think everyone should enjoy it and people should learn quite a bit from this. So take it away, Dan.
Thank you very much for that very strong introduction, Jill. I really appreciate it. A few things extra that you guys can know about me in terms of my involvement with AACE. I am a major contributor and was on the group of people running the Rising Professionals Committee for the last couple of years. So I've also been involved on that level and have done a lot of work with that group. I'm currently partially involved, but no longer as a leader in that group right now. But a little bit of context to this is that it originally started with our internal company with MVP and the challenge to develop a presentation or a breakout session, as we call them, to talk about something that you feel strongly about when it comes to success, whether that's building success, having success, creating success, whatever that might be for you as an individual. And so I, of course, wanted to go in the opposite direction, as you can see here, and discuss the idea of success through and success with failure. I believe that it's something that's not talked about nearly enough. And I think there's a lot that can be gained from looking into something like this. And that's where this presentation, that's where these ideas stemmed from. Now, I will alert you at the beginning of this, I'm not a professional in psychology or in anything having to do with this level of detail. But this presentation was put together using a lot of literature and a lot of things that I personally did research on. And I'm going to be sharing my thoughts, opinions, ideas, as well as some related models that I've gained while doing my research across this subject matter. As Jill did say, questions are definitely something I would love to answer. For now, while we're doing the presentation, put them in the chat and I can address them at the end, unless it's something that you really believe needs to be communicated or needs to be understood directly in the moment. Move this over, there we go. Overall learning objectives and the purpose of this presentation, as I already started to discuss, is going through the idea of what failure means, what failure can become, and the way that failure can ultimately work when you see it in the right perspective and the right light. Now, a lot of times when we think about the word, it's often in the negative. And I'll address a lot of this later on in the presentation, but really what we're going to try to do is walk through some of the reasons and the analysis as to why that's seen that way. And then we're going to discuss a few of the ways that you can rethink and reposition yourself when it comes to failure and talking about it and using it moving forward. So we're going to discuss multiple types of failures. We're going to talk about techniques and skills and different things that you can use both personally as well as in your industry, in your company, on your project, whatever that might be, to be able to develop a better understanding of it, as well as to be able to change the pattern that you use when you see or experience failure. And we'll also just open up conversation, open up mindsets, open up ideas. That's one of the biggest things I like to gain out of this, is that if you walk away with one or two things on your mind that you just want to talk about, or you just want to discuss with somebody else, that's a really important aspect of this. This is not an open and shut case, and this is not something that you just put a bow on and it's done after this. It's something that should be personalized and customized to whatever you're doing, using some of the ideas that we can discuss here. Straightforward on the RCIP standards, this is something that can be credited, and we will have to make sure that we have participation afterwards, as well as a review that will be sent out after the meeting itself.
Yeah, Dan, I'm not sure about that because I'm not sure we ran it through them again.
Oh,
so there should
okay.
be credit for attending the meeting. I don't know about the RCEP. Sorry, guys.
Oh, okay. Well, we had that in there from before because it's been certified before, but it will be credit for the class regardless from Jill's standpoint with us. So to start us off, what we're going to do is we're going to do a small riddle challenge for everybody. And I'm going to put the rules on the next slide. Everyone will have a chance to look through it, and then I'm going to give you roughly 4 minutes to figure it out. When you have completed it, or you think you have an answer, you can go to the participants tab right here, and you can just raise your hand. So that's after you've come up with a solution. It doesn't have to be necessarily what you think is the right one, but if you've come up with one, just put that up so I'll get an idea of how everyone's doing in those minutes. Everyone has to do it on their own. No cheating or talking with anybody else, although no one's in the same room, so that shouldn't be too hard. And then a little bit of a caveat, and try to put this in the box of this little challenge. And that would be if your age ends in an odd number, there's no consequences if you get it wrong. But in this challenge, in this situation, if your age ends in an even number and you don't get the right answer, then technically you would not be able to continue this presentation. So we're trying to create some stakes, and we're trying to create a little bit of pressure that exists on this challenge. So I'm going to put it up on the next slide, and then the 4 minutes will begin after everyone's able to take in the challenge. So take a minute to read across the challenge. It's a very straightforward problem. There are no loopholes. There's nothing outside of the question here that you need to use to be able to solve this. Everything is contained within the rules that exist here and within the information that is provided to you. Many times people would suggest trying to draw this out using different, whatever you need to do with it. This was in person, so people were using pens and paper and everything else, but any way that you want to solve this, you can take a shot at it. So I'm going to start the 4-minute timer. Everyone read through the problem, start to solve it, see what you can get. And when you come up with an answer, raise your hand in the participation area, and I'll see that you've come up with an answer. Normally there would be a bit of a buzz of people trying to solve this and figure it out and trying different solutions. So the silence may be good for your ability to think through the problem, but it's a little bit of a different environment when everyone's in their own space trying to solve it. But however, you can come up with an answer for this.
People with their cameras on look deep in thought, so I think it's going well.
That's good. I hope it's not a blank stare. I hope it's more of a thought-provoking stare, as you said, Jill. And Jill, please don't give away the answer, as I know you've been through this at least once. give another about a minute and a half left for everyone to try to work on something. And like I said, if you do have an answer that you feel good about, come in and raise your hand in the participation window right here. I'll at least know that you've gotten an answer to it. Whether or not you feel good about it, that's a different question, but any answers, good to go. Okay, about another 30 seconds. So whatever you're working on, try to come to some type of conclusion. But I'm glad to see that no one has solved it incredibly fast this time around. Okay, and as they used to say, pencils down, books closed, all finished up. All right, so I didn't have anyone raise their hand, which could mean that people just weren't looking at that part of it, or that everyone really didn't come to an answer that they felt comfortable with. So what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna go to the next page and walk you guys through what the solution is. And if you think you actually got it right, or you came really close, I'll even give you that. I would like you to try to go raise your hand just so I know if anybody got it correct or was very, very close. So step one is that you and your buddy cross with the spear together. And as the rules say, the slowest person is always going to be the longest amount of time it takes to cross. So that takes you 2 minutes. When you cross back by yourself, you bring the spear with you, and that takes 1 minute, giving you a 3-minute total time thus far. Your brother and your cousin then cross with the spear together. This will be the longest time it takes for people to cross, which will take 10 total minutes, and that'll bring the total time altogether to 13 minutes. They hand it back off to your buddy, who crosses back to you for 2 minutes, giving you 15 total minutes. Then you and your buddy cross back over the bridge together, taking that 2 minutes once again for you and him or her, and that gives you 17 total minutes. This is pretty much the only solution to this question, and it does require a little bit of working through the problem. Most people could not, I don't think I've had anybody solve it this quickly, but we can't spend 15 to 20 minutes solving a problem like this. So it's more of just a brain teaser to see how you feel about it. I'm gonna check to see if anyone got it correct. I don't think so. No, that's all right. The idea here is, if the stakes were in front of you and you knew that you could be fired or you could be taken off of a job or some other negative consequence versus going through that problem and solving it without many consequences, or at least without consequences that were going to be very harsh, how does that change your mindset? And how does that allow you to think? Does it close your mind when you're worried or nervous about the consequences? Or does having a longer leash, so to speak, does that allow you to be more innovative or inventive in your solution and how you approach a problem? And that's something that we hope to emulate a little bit with a problem like that, because you're supposed to feel the consequences if you're on one group versus the other group. It's a little bit harder because I never was actually going to kick you out of this meeting. I think you probably knew that ahead of time. But when you try to contextualize that in the real world and in our jobs and industries, we understand that that's definitely something you're constantly thinking about. It's not just, if I get it right, that's great. If I get it wrong, no big deal. Usually there's more to gain and more to lose on either end. So we're going to try to understand that and see what kind of observations we can draw, and then maybe how we can use that understanding to create a new mindset or create a new mentality about the idea of not succeeding for doing a hard problem or a hard job in many people's cases. We roll over into the idea to describe or define failure. And there's going to be a lot of quotes in this corner. And I'm not going to read all of them because there's just one on almost every single slide, but I'd like for you to at least take a look at it. Some of them are really simple and straightforward. Some of them are a little bit more nuanced, but they all have to do with the idea of ways that failure has been seen as a positive or even a necessity to some people who we could consider successful, you could consider them very wise, you could consider them extremely adaptive or creative, however you want to. It's going to be a mixture of artists and people in business and all types of different famous people, for the most part at least, who have talked about the idea of failure. And my approach to it is I didn't want to define it as something concrete or even define it as something straightforward. So I like to go in the opposite direction once again and go with what it is not, or what it at least should not be. And the way we're going to approach this is that failure should not be something that is final. It shouldn't be the last stop, and it shouldn't be the last thing that you hear about from something or someone just because they had failed or because it had failed. It's also not uncommon. And one of the phrases I always like to use is one of the most common used phrases, that the only thing you can have certainty in life are death and taxes, right? I like to add in failure because I don't think there's a single person who's ever lived who hasn't failed in some way, shape, or form. Now, maybe it's not a massive failure, but there's definitely something that every one of us can share as a commonality, and that's you've failed in some way at some time in your life. Could be when you were a kid, it could have been yesterday, could be today. I think for the most part, we can all hold that as a common theme that we could all relate to each other in that way. Maybe not the same exact failure, of course, but definitely that we all have faced that feeling of not achieving or not accomplishing something or not doing it the way you wanted it to be done. And finally, I like to believe that it is not inherently a negative thing. Failure is not something that needs to be seen as a downplayed thing that you should never talk about, or something that you need to just sweep under the rug because it's so negative, and that we shouldn't be able to talk about our failures. I think it's something that needs to be more brought to the front and brought to light and brought to a point where you can feel comfortable talking about it, and that's how we can move forward. So a view of failure in our industry, as we bring it a little bit more focused to the people on this call, to our industry as a whole, and we're going to try to break down and understand in some ways why failure has its current viewpoint and the perspective that people bring to it in the time that we're living in now, kind of the near future, the near past, a bit of a module of understanding from that. And we're also going to think, is this good, the way that it's seen and the way that it's treated, or is this bad? Is it something that's actually counterproductive? Is it hurting us? Is it holding us back? And what are the ways in which it's doing that? And are there ways to fix that or make it better? The other idea that we could dive into in a lot of this conversation is, does perception play a role when you hear about something failing? Does your previous experiences or people that you've previously worked with, or your previous mentality perhaps, play a role in it that you automatically go to a certain mindset or a certain thought process when you think of failure and when you think of a failed project, a failed assignment, a failed job, a failed relationship, whatever that is? Do you have an automatic perception of what that means, or can we look at it with a much wider lens and maybe be able to better understand it? So this is a play kind of on the duality of failure and the way that it can be seen in both lights. And this is more of a mindset and mentality that we can break down into these two sides. And when you think about it as bad, the perception and the view of it is that it's the end all be all, right? We know that you've made a failure, you're done, it's over, that's it. And you don't talk about it again, that person doesn't work again, whatever that might be. It also can be used as a definitive pass fail. You either passed or you failed, right? You either got where you needed to or you didn't, and that's it. That's the end of the conversation. There's no discussion afterwards. And then finally, as a punishment justification, right? So a failure equals a dock or fired or whatever that might be. It's a one-to-one. Now, we're not saying that failure has to be completely wiped off to the side, but a one-to-one punishment justification for it is definitely a way that it can be seen as bad, negative, and just a pure on one side of the line when we're looking at failure. On the other side, a learning tool is definitely something that failure can be very useful on. And it's a way of being able to extract out what the failure was, the ways that thing went wrong, something that happened, a breakdown in communication, and use that as a learning tool moving forward. And we'll talk a lot more about the ways that we do that and the ways that we can do it even better in the future. it also should be reviewed in context. So a failure shouldn't just be plucked out from a certain person or a certain project and just deemed that that was wrong and something else was right. You need to look at all the details of what led to that failure and what led to things not going the way that they wanted to, and understanding that and moving forward. And that leads to the last point of not one size can fit every single failure, because they're all individual. And that's why you need that context to understand every aspect of what happened and to be able to figure out exactly where things may have gone off track. We're going to take those two groups, that duality of failure, and we're going to look at it in two different lights. So this is what's called the negative cycle of failure. And this takes you through the way that having a bad mentality or having a bad misconception, pre-notion, whatever you want to call it on failure, can really get you stuck in a really bad cycle, in a bad circular habit. So we're going to start at the top with failure. It moves over to the next where you cast blame and point fingers, right? There's no context. You're not really looking to see what the problems were. You're just trying to put blame on someone. You're just trying to have someone be, maybe it's the person responsible, or maybe it's a scapegoat, but someone's just trying to assign it to somebody. You then go to the next step of holding the people responsible and you reprimand them, right? You have a negative consequence, regardless of looking at the big picture, for that failure every single time. There's no question about it. It's just how it's going to be, and that's the fact of it. When you utilize that type of mentality, you then go to a culture that is, you can never fail, because failing equals negative consequences. And for a lot of people, that gets completely stuck in their mind of, okay, I need to always work to not fail rather than to succeed. There's this interesting way that switches the gears in your brain, where you just don't want the negative instead of striving for the positive. And that leads you into workers not trying to innovate or take any chances, right? Because the negatives so far outweigh the positives that you're just going to continually not try to fail, which you're not going to be creative, you're not going to innovate, you're not going to find those better solutions. You're going to stick with something that you know won't let you fail, a very tried and true method, which, yes, can be effective and can work, but does limit your creative abilities and your ability to go innovate. This then continues the cycle that your practices overall, the group as an overall mentality, just doesn't really push forward, doesn't really make that significant progress that many people want to make, especially in our industry where there's opportunity everywhere, but you stay stagnant and you don't really find ways to get better and to evolve and to be on that next level. And ultimately, that leads to failure. Now, whether that is in the short term, which it may not always be, but in the long term, if you're not developing and you're not growing, you're not innovating, that can be very hard to continue to succeed in some way, because you're facing a lot of people and a lot of groups and companies, whatever you want to refer to, that are doing that. And that makes it very difficult to continue to succeed. And you see that failure kind of swing back around in that circle. So we flip it over to the other side and we talk about a way that this cycle, and I like to call it a cycle because failure can still be something that, while you don't need it to happen, it's a big part of continuing to develop and to evolve. And it's a whole new cycle that we're looking at. So the failure, again, is with the starting point. We then move to gain a better understanding of the failure, something we discussed earlier in putting failure into context. And that allows a non-immediate reaction to happen. And you get to better understand what happened in that moment on that project and really put it into a good light of what you're trying to understand. Now, some failures are purely a one-stop shop, and that's what it is. But most of the time, there's more details at hand, and there's something bigger or more interesting going on that you want to gain a better understanding of. That pushes you into reforming your ideas about how to work. Say it was a breakdown in communication. If you were able to gain a better understanding and showing that a client or an owner didn't respond well to phone calls, and instead they were much more receptive to email and or in person, but the person on the project was constantly calling them. That's why you want to be able to gain a better understanding of something, because if you just take it out of context, it's bad communication. But if you put it back into a much more useful and a much more developed way of looking at it, you can better gain that that client specifically is just not someone that you need to be calling, not someone that you should be communicating with on the phone, and you can reform how you work with that client. Again, that leads to forming a new strategy as well as a mindset, which in this instance of the example, it could be just being very flexible and understanding that just because the best communication for you is X, that doesn't mean it works for the client or somebody else. And that will allow you to have that strategy moving forward. And hopefully you can implement that into practice, which it could apply on other projects. It could be something that's being missed on other jobs with other clients, that they have different needs. And by identifying that and by being able to flesh that out, you can then develop these new ideas, these new strategies, and make sure that they're done across the board. Finally, it leads you to being a success, hopefully, as your industry or your market leader, which you're pushing the forefront of it. You're the one making the strides. You're the one finding those innovative solutions because you're diving deeper into the issues that you've been having, and you're finding ways to develop that into a more successful path forward. And the kind of tilt here is that if you are doing that as the industry leader, many times the industry is going to adjust. People are going to find ways to replicate that, or going to find ways to maybe reproduce that. And then you're on that front space and you can go ahead and try something new and maybe fail again. Maybe try something a little bit different because you need to offer that to your client. That might result in a failure, but you can go through that same process knowing you have a team of people that can turn that into something better, that can turn that into something that becomes a success. I do like to caveat, before we get too far down into the well, there definitely are some pitfalls of over justifying or being too okay with failure. And one of the first ones I talk about is you never want it to be a key main strategy, right? You never want that to be this goal or this idea that failure is so great that you should always get it. And if you don't get it, then you have actually underachieved on something. That shouldn't be viewed as the pure mindset. And that's where you can overstep the line and make it a little bit too much in that direction of the good side of failure. You also need to clearly identify the differentiation between accepting failure, which is admitting that it was so okay that everything is fine, and not fearing failure, which is the mentality that you don't allow the possibility of failure to deter your innovation and your creativity. And that's the one where we really want to focus on the mentality, the mindset, and the culture, rather than admitting failure was okay and accepting it as just something that's fine. We want to really focus on the not fearing of it, not allowing failure to be this driving force of not going and doing something. And then finally, as a lot of people have stated before with practice and other types of things, you don't want to just do the same thing over and over again. That's how you go towards a cycle of insanity, as some would say, or just not making real progress, right? So I did use a cycle in the previous analogy and in the previous visual, but in this case, we're talking about not looking at the details of the failure, assigning the blame, and just continuing to do the same thing wrong over and over again, because there's no lessons being learned on that. There's nothing being gained from that. So we're going to try and shift gears a little bit for this part of the presentation and talk about where and why failure can be linked to the idea of success. And when we talked about the positive cycle of failure, we did show at one point that when you implement those new ideas, you can find success as an innovator, as a market leader, or in some other space maybe. It doesn't have to necessarily be that, but finding the gaps and being able to fill those with your new ideas and with from failures does allow you to find success in one of many ways. So here we note that when you change your perspective, when you change your mindset, as we talked about, that's going to be a big key in being able to move past the failures in a useful, creative, and positive way, rather than keeping that same viewpoint and not being able to do that. So if you treat failure in a much more positive than negative mindset, you can also assign it to the idea of the overall group or an environmental condition, as I've pointed out here, which is that failure has multiple levels and it has multiple ways of manifesting itself. And diving deeper into it, you might find that there were multiple times and multiple levels over multiple periods that led to this one failure, or it could be a series of failures that all piled up on each other or may have caused one another that led to a substantial failure at the end. And being able to break those down and find each of those individual failures can really, really help correct a process, or it can help make a process more straightforward or more sharp or more streamlined or lean, whatever word you want to use. That's where we're able to gain this better link and this better key to turning that into success. We definitely point out lessons learned a lot in our industry. And I think a lot of people on this presentation have probably given a lessons learned breakout session. They've written papers on it. They've talked about it for their projects. And I honestly believe that it's one of the best tools we have in this industry to be able to utilize a lot of what we're talking about, because lessons learned does a great job. It deep dives, it goes into all the details of what happened, what could have been done better, all of those aspects. I argue here that lessons learned, while a very useful tool, doesn't see as much usage as it should when it comes to the follow-up, and when it comes to working things in down the line, and when it comes to being able to develop those ideas into practice and into other areas of success and other areas of positive engagement down the line. And it's a question of why and how can we make that better. And I think a lot of people may even think about their own experiences where it felt like so much work and effort and detail went into a lessons learned, and you actually saw that same problem manifest itself maybe a year from then, maybe 5 years from then. And you look back and say, well, how come we didn't prevent this? And it feels like a lot of that effort maybe wasn't utilized well enough. Maybe it wasn't put into enough context, and it was isolated to that one project or that one area or even that one client, to the point of not expanding that out and understanding that that failure or those number of failures could be applied way more and much more vastly across the jobs and projects that you're working on. So we're looking for that point at where understanding failure and breaking it down can mesh with success. And the more we dive into it, the more parallels we can actually see between the two. And I already touched on lessons learned, but I like to really reiterate the fact that it is truly one of our industry's best ways and best practices of trying to figure out what happened. And the idea that you get to take a look at places where you came up short, or the reasons that something broke down, or the reasons that a project was over budget, over time, whatever the issue was, or whatever the failure was, you get a really good chance to take a look at that. It doesn't have to be done immediately and right away, and I want this on my desk in a week. Usually you get time to really go through everything. Sometimes you have to walk through multiple claims. Sometimes you have to go do a complete schedule review and really compare from baseline all the way to the end of the project, and that gives you a great insight into where things went wrong. And I think the level of detail and effort that goes into lessons learned is so valuable and useful, and I just really want to embrace the idea of not allowing that to fall to the wayside, and using one of the best tools that we have as an industry to make sure that those issues and those problems are not constantly repeated. Even if they do find failure in the future, that at least someone could say, well, we looked back at this lessons learned and we implemented this, this, and this. 3 of those 4 really worked. 1 still had its issues. And then you move on from there. But at least progress is being made in those things. And I would invite you maybe to share a lessons learned in the chat that maybe after the fact we could discuss or someone could talk about. I'm going to continue moving on from here, but I'm sure plenty of you have great lessons learned, and that could be really great to share in the chat right now and then maybe talk about afterwards. So we find this mesh of failure and success. And one of the things that we can go deeper into and identify is what causes people to be scared or hesitant because of failure. Why is failure holding someone back? Why is failure halting progress? What is the cause of that? And really there's 2 main causes that someone may fear or be nervous about failure. One is just the consequences. The consequences are negative. It's, I'll lose my job. I'll get kicked off the project. I won't make this much money. I won't be able to do this, that, and the other, right? It's just a straightforward punishment type of system that is going to cause failure to be directly associated with a negative consequence. The other reason, which is a little bit more up there, a little bit more hard to grasp right away, is the fear of the realization that something or some action or some initiative just feasibly isn't possible. It can't be figured out. It can't be done. The problem can't be solved. Whatever you want that analogy to be, it drives people to say, well, I shouldn't even attempt it. And then I won't have to worry about if it's doable or not, or if I can achieve that level of success or not. And those two things many times will work in parallel, but a lot of times they can also be separated out, and you can clearly see which one's driving someone one side or the other, whether it's consequences or the fear of not being able to achieve something. And it's broken down into the consequences is environmental attitude, and it can be completely controlled, completely altered, and it can be changed very much so by whether it's leadership, whether it's a group of people. It's very much so something that can be changed very quickly as well. The other end of it is a little bit more complex in terms of understanding why someone fears not being able to do something. And that's a mindset. It's a bit of a mentality that, yes, it can be fixed and solved, but usually it runs deeper than just the idea of a consequence driving you. And it's a little bit more on a grander scale for understanding that. And that applies to multiple different areas. And that can be personal life as well as in your professional career, where those things could hold you back, not because of some negative consequence, but as it says here, because you fear that it may not be possible. So let's take the idea of the first one, the fear of the consequences. And I like to call this the punishment pyramid, not just because it's great alliteration, but because it kind of stacks and shows you the way that having that mentality of negative consequences due to failure can kind of stack on itself and build into this negative outlook. And so we start at the base when we look at this type of an image, and it's taking, again, a failure, a single failure, a large failure, multiple failures even, completely out of context, and just looking at it as that end all be all, that straightforward failure. You didn't achieve this, you didn't make this on time, it was over budget. That's a fail, right? You move to the next one, which stacks on top of that failure, which is that extra punishment, that reprimand, quick reactive mentalities to these failures. And basically what that is insinuating or inciting, whatever you want to use, is that someone is taking the opportunity to point at that failure and say, that's bad, that can't happen again, and this is how I'm going to stop it. And that's by making a decision to use a punishment or to, sometimes it comes in the form of yelling at someone, sometimes it comes in the form of demoting them, whatever you want to call it. It's too much of a straightforward linear path to looking at this, and it doesn't take much time or realization to be able to develop whatever happened in that moment and on that failure. And finally, you top this whole pyramid off and you weigh everything down with the idea right at the tippy top, and this is what sticks in employees and people's brains and in their mentality, is that mistakes are fatal. And it becomes this, again, the scared idea that I'm so fearful of failing, I am not going to risk anything, and I'm not going to take any chances. And that creates this pyramid where the failure weighs so heavily on that one person, or it could be multiple people, maybe it's even a whole team, but it weighs so heavily that it doesn't allow any mobility. It doesn't allow you get trapped under that pyramid. So what are some of the ways that you can overcome, especially when it comes to the idea of consequences driving that fear? Some of the techniques and some of the tried ideas are really trying to almost over pursue, right? But develop a strong positive environment that can dismiss failure as a cutting block. And so you don't get to the point where someone fears that one singular failure is going to push them into a point of no return, which could be getting kicked off the project, it could be losing a job. You take that away. You don't make that into this ultimatum that people have to constantly deal with. Now, yes, if someone was at the point of that because of multiple incidents and they weren't just failures, they were a lot of other things, then we're in a different ballpark. This is strictly for trying to identify where something went wrong that could have been prevented or could be done a different way. We're not talking about if someone's late all the time. If someone's late all the time and they can never be counted on, that's not failure. That's more of a personal thing that doesn't really exist in the context that we're talking about here. The second one, and this is always going to be useful no matter what field you're in and no matter what you're dealing with, is always pursuing high levels of communication. And you're pushing conversation and you're trying to talk through and figure out what happened with failure. And you replace the anger and the punishment and the yelling and the quick action with conversation and context and constructive criticism. And that's where you can remove some of that heavy pyramid that we were looking at, and you take away finger pointing and you don't blame people right off the bat. You do still want to understand who was possibly responsible, why it happened, but you don't need to immediately finger point, throw everything at one person and move forward from there. And finally, you understand that failure assigns a reflective mindset, an informed mindset about what happened, not a quick reaction and a chop it off at the head mindset that we dismissed earlier that does weigh heavily. So we flip everything on its head, right? We turn the heavy weight of it into this cone, I like to call it. And again, we can start at the bottom and move to the top, but it's a bit of a different feel on this one. And so you take the failure in context, and you then can develop discussions, critiquing, and constructive feedback, which can build the employee's confidence, it can build the assignment's confidence, and you can gain that knowledge, and you can find ways to learn from the mistake and learn from the failure. And you finally arrive at the knowledge and understanding of mistakes that crafts future success. And that kind of allows you to take that failure and really build it into something much more effective and much more useful for your future. And it just exists in this world where you're really keying in on trying to discuss and critique and find ways to make things better and utilize what has happened in the past and be able to create something better and a better path forward for the future. And it really all continues to wrap into that idea of taking away the mentality and the ideology of the hyper negativity of failures in the world and where those things take place, and look at the actual details and look at the actual crux of what happened and be able to formulate that into a successful idea. If we look into more of the worry of not succeeding, the fact that something can't be achieved or that it will fail because it's just so hard or it takes too much effort or it's just going to be too much time that we put into it. That's a little bit more complex one that I touched on earlier. And we see that in this instance, it's much more of a weighing of your options, a risk reward, or a battle of what you should focus on or how you should concentrate your efforts. And there's these two ideas that kind of push against each other. And one is that a worthwhile idea or a strategy is going to be challenging, and it's going to be tough to develop it and to implement it once you can do that. And that's resources, that's time, that's energy, that could be multiple people. All of those different things are going to be key to being able to create an idea, a strategy that people really find worthwhile. But then you have the other side where if you don't do it correctly, and if you don't utilize your time well, and if the team just can't figure it out, and that idea that it's not achievable could cause setbacks and it could cause delays, whether that's to your company as a whole, whether that's just to a project. It does exist a risk. And that risk is where people don't feel comfortable entering into. People don't think that it's worthwhile to take that leap because of the risk and the possible negatives that come with it. So how do we deal with that dynamic? How do we deal with these two forces that are seemingly really going against each other on that? There's not a one simple answer. There's not something that's going to just straightforward allow you to take a lot of chances, but at the same time mitigate all the risk that comes with it and be okay with that, because that's just not smart business. It's not a smart way to go about things. It's not a smart way to run a project, right? But there's still the idea that needs to exist that while you want to succeed now and you don't want things to get off track and you don't want to feel discouraged, there's also the longing and the need even for long-term success. And a long-term advantage that you can create over your competition, over the industry, over anything else that you're dealing with. And that's really the crux of being able to change our mentality of failure, because everybody would say that having a long-term strategy, being able to build ideas out for that, and being able to be creative and innovative with that is a good thing. But everyone would also say that short-term success is very important. You can't move forward if you're not succeeding in the now. And if we don't have that, how can we have a forward-thinking plan if we're not succeeding right now? So it's really on, and this is from talking with a lot of leadership. This is from talking with many different people in other industries as well, such as the tech industry and different people in the business industry, that there's always going to be a fear of getting behind, or of not being able to push forward with an idea, or not being able to work in the now as well, right? If you're constantly worried about the future, you're not focusing on the now, and then vice versa. So being able to create levels and being able to create groups that have team support as well as leadership support and other people buying into the idea will allow you to both take risks, innovate, and be able to push your ideas forward, especially using the past failures and using different things that haven't succeeded, as well as focus on your success today. And I think a lot of people would say the ideal solution is that you get to work and implement things in the now that you hope are successful and that can get you so far. And when you do find those faults, when you do find those failures because you did try to do something interesting, innovative, insightful, that you can quickly have a system where you identify those failures in those instances, and you can use the process and use the team that you already have set up to be able to change that and fix that and create something better moving forward, which contributes to your long-term strategy, but also can be used in your short-term work and your short-term project and your short-term strategies. So it's a dynamic that does have to exist, and it has to have communication. It has to have people that are bought into it, leadership bought into it. It has to have a crux of people that believe in it. Because if you have one area or one piece of this that doesn't buy into it, and that when something does fail or something goes wrong, that means that the whole thing should be shut down, or that the whole idea of what's going on needs to be stopped, then you're going to come to a point where the work that you've put into on the long term is thrown out or is treated as it's just not going to happen. And the short term took a bit of a loss to its success because there wasn't 100% focus on just getting the job done or just doing something in the present. So that idea of being bought in needs to be communicated and needs to be on multiple levels in order for this to be achieved in a way that is going to provide success on all levels, short-term, mid-term, long-term, as well as putting a process in place that isn't just a one-time thing. It's the idea and the philosophy and the mentality that employees and teams and projects can have these failures and can have these shortcomings, and that doesn't mean that there's not be success being found both in the now but definitely in the future. It doesn't spell the end. It just spells a new chapter with a new innovation and a new idea that builds that practice and that strategy for the future. So it leads us to the idea of a whole, that failure can truly be one vehicle for innovation. Now, it can come from a lot of other places and a lot of other areas. That's completely reasonable, and plenty of other people have talked about that and other ways that innovation and ingenuity and that new level of thinking can be achieved. But failure definitely has a place amongst all of those. And it definitely has its usefulness and its value when it comes to producing new ideas. Because new ideas many times come in the face of strain and they come in the face of opportunity. And when you can see a failure as an opportunity to gain knowledge, to gain insight and gain information, you turn every single instance that something goes slightly wrong or isn't the right way, you turn that into an opportunity. You turn that into something that can be shared, can be detailed out, and can be flipped on its head into a positive and into this piece that will be used hopefully in the short-term future, but maybe it's the long-term future that really pays off, that you've put the effort and the mentality of treating that failure as something truly unique, because there's never going to be the same exact failure every single time within reason, but every experience can be put into context, and every process and every project has some uniqueness to it that you can pull details and information from and be able to put it into a context that can be used in the future in a new way that nothing else has. And so if you're not scared, and I say scared as in the fears we talked about earlier, if you're not scared to take those risks and that risk of failure, that's where the strongest innovation can lead and can come from, because you've found a way around and you found a way through the idea that failure is a negative, and you've been able to take that into a heavier context and a much more developed mindset and turn that into that opportunity and take that risk and find that innovation. But it can't happen unless people are bought in and unless people don't fear the idea of failure. And that's really where everything comes full circle. It's eliminating the mentality and the fear of it. It's creating a strong team environment, and a strong environment from leadership all the way down to your analysts or your engineer. And it's being able to keep all pathways open so that failure can be discussed openly and positively and truthfully, and develop that into something much better, much stronger, and in many cases, much more successful down the road. So how do we change it, and where do we get to that point? I say it again because it shouldn't necessarily be the goal, but failure definitely shouldn't be the deterrent. It should not be something that you hold over someone's head, and it should not be something that's constantly referred to in a bad light and in a way that makes people feel either ashamed or upset or something truly negative about it. Can we change that view? And can we find ways to develop this into something truly useful, not just for ourselves and not even just for our team, but for the entire industry and for everyone else? And I truly believe we can. I think there's a lot of things already in place, such as attention to detail and lessons learned and other aspects. And I think it's just utilizing that and putting that into practice and being able to really share that across multiple landscapes with multiple groups and multiple levels, and finding that new culture, that new communication, and that new mentality. And I think that will bring us to a much better place. And I think that will create innovation as well as future success and strategy across the whole industry for a much longer term solution and a longer timeline. A little bit of a wrap up, reiterating a lot of what I already said, but what you really can do is you encourage yourself as well as your team members to be okay with that positive idea of failure and looking at it in a different light. Generate some excitement on teams, especially if it's an innovation team, but any team on a project, that taking some risks here and there is beneficial. It's not seen as if you don't get this right, it's over. It's more seen as this is something you should pursue and something you should go after. And then you can develop a plan that takes advantage of the failures. You can use those levels that we talked about earlier, use those people, leadership, team members, other people in the industry, and you create a plan, you create an idea, you create multiple pathways, and then you can evolve it for the future. You can take all of those different aspects, utilize the different resources that you have, that we have as an industry, and we can find as a whole a much better strategy, a much better future, and honestly eliminate some of these failures, but also create new, better ones in the future. And that's really the way we're going to turn over, and the industry is going to be able to succeed on that higher level and in that better place. Again, I want to thank everyone for joining in and being able to be a part of this virtually. I know in person is always great, but I think the virtual environment has been done very well by this group and putting this together. I'm going to check into the chat and see if anyone has any questions or things that they would like to bring up, but we can also open up the microphones for people to speak. And if you want to be on video, that's great. If you don't, you can just use audio. But again, I want to thank you guys for taking the time to listen, and I'm happy to discuss any of the things I talked about, or just if you guys have any experiences you want to share, I'm happy to hear those too. Jill, I think people can go unmuted now. Well, they might have been able to the whole time, but.
Yep, I see Don unmuted. Do you have something you want to ask, Don?
I see that as well.
Srini?
He might not know he's unmuted. It's possible. If anyone has any questions in the chat, I saw someone, I think it was just an answer to the question earlier, 1 and 2, and then 3 and 4. That was a good start. I think that was probably a little simplistic for it, but it was a good start. But if any, I mean, it doesn't even have to be about this in particular. It could be about resources that I utilized, or it could just be about something that you experienced. I'm happy to talk about that. I'm also happy to talk offline off of this as well if you think of something later. Will slides be available to download? Jill, that is more of a question for yourself.
I would think so. I sent an email to Krista. Let's just wait and see if we need to take the RCEP slide out.
Okay, yeah.
And unless you have anything against it, I think we should be able to share them with that slide out.
Sure. I do not have anything against that. I'd be happy to have people as this as a resource. And it is a document that I'm going to be developing much more, down the line, but I'm happy to share that with people. So we can take a look at and talk with Krista about that. That's fine.
Yep.
Thank you for your question.
Dan is also an expert on the Silverline Yard. If you have any questions about that, just to change the subject slightly, if not.
I could switch gears if someone really wants to know a specific question. It's mostly finished, so most of it's there. I have pictures of it if someone else wants to. If you want a picture, I can send something.
Dan,
Yes.
I'd like to thank you for your presentation. It was wonderful. I don't know anybody here other than Doug Mitten. I'm Don Parker. I used to be with the National Capital Chapter in Washington.
Okay.
I'm down here in Knightdale, North Carolina. You're listening to you. I don't often get to a meeting. This was a perfect excuse to get to one.
Fair enough. Well, I appreciate it. Thank you very much, Don, for tuning in. And again, I'm available with any other questions or anything in the future. So appreciate you.
Well, I made a lot of mistakes in my life, so I'm happy to hear that you forgive them.
Absolutely. Just share your knowledge, Don. I'm sure that's the best way you can pass on those failures.
Jill, we can upload this video into AACEI NCS web YouTube channel, right?
I have no idea on that. That's a question that's above my technological abilities.
We'll figure out.
We should be able to pull the recording down pretty quickly, and then I think it can be utilized that way.
Okay.
Yeah, we can upload and AACEI NCS YouTube channel.
Okay.
I didn't even know we had a YouTube channel.
I think you have. We used to have it one in. Yeah.
I think some of the presentations from the annual meeting have been put on there before, if I'm not mistaken, because I know some of them got recorded.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. Chowdhury usually has a team that knows all the IT stuff.
Okay.
We figure it out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. Any more questions, thoughts? Anything else that anyone would like to address here? I'm happy to. If not, no big deal. And I just appreciate everyone's time and for coming on this afternoon.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.
Absolutely. It was my pleasure to be able to come on. And like I said, I think my contact information, Jill, was in the invite in some capacity, either my email or something else. So I'm happy to talk with anyone one-on-one or discuss some of these ideas further if anyone has any questions.
Appreciate it.
Of course.
Thanks, Dan.
No problem.
All right. It was lovely to see some of you, talk to some of you. I'm glad we got to connect with people. I heard, Don, you said you were in North Carolina?
Yes, I'm in North Carolina.
Heard someone was in Richmond, I believe.
I lived up in McLean for about 50 years, and my wife died 6 years ago. So 3 years ago, I moved down here to be with my daughter, and
Nice.
I remarried, and so that's here I am. And like I say, I don't get up there to very many meetings, and they don't have a chapter in North Carolina. So I
Happy to bring it
appreciate
to you.
Well, I'm glad you could make it.
appreciate the opportunity to meet a bunch of you, and
We'll do it again sometime.
fine.
Thank
That's
you,
good.
Dan.
That's good. Okay, thanks
course.
much. I'm going
All
to
right.
sign off then. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, Jill.
All right. Yep. And Krista's going to look into see if we could get RCEP credit.
Okay. We can always take that out too, like you said, if we have to. It's
Yeah,
not
she
so
just
much
got
big deal.
back, so she's
Okay.
like, by now, I assume you mean right now. I was like, yeah, right now. Okay. Thank you, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, Dan, and thank you,
Of course.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. See you guys all in October for
15th joint conference, joint panel meeting.
Oh, great. Be on the lookout.
all right.
Say
Thank you, you too.